yesterday we had one of the meetings of the intermediate school juries in here. And at the end of the day there was a discussion, and one of the things that came up was the discussion of the relationship between the kind of work that we do in the school and what we might do when we're out of school, basically. And what is the relationship of these two kinds of work, if indeed there are two kinds of work, to each other. And I think that Nick's work, in a way, can be a very good example of that relationship in terms of the kind of work that we do in the school and its connection to what we do out of school. Because the AA has Nick Grimshaw's final thesis downstairs in the slide library. We have slides of it. And if you go down there and have a look, you'll see that his final project is for a university building in Covent Garden. And the kinds of themes that he was dealing with at that time as a fifth-year student, in terms of aspects of flexibility, the relationship of the project to the city, the use of technology, the connection between aspects of production and the impact of that on design are very much things that he certainly was interested in, believed in, and has obviously since the latter part of the 60s has tried to continue very systematically in his work. Again, also, if you look at two of the very early projects, for example, very small projects, the addition that was made to the hostel, or the apartment building that was built on Park Road, you see that there is an incredible attempt and engagement to try and really, through this, his thinking, for example, in terms of certain ideas of technology, how to transform the content of the architectural project. In the Park Road scheme, somehow not really following the image of what public housing was, but becoming more involved with the relationship of industrial production now to the architectural project. The whole schema of the housing project was transformed. And I think this is something that's really an inspiration, and it's an important part of the way that the office has also been developing the projects. I think it's also very important to see that not only through this aspect of technology, but also in terms of the engagement with urbanism, the projects have become much more really urban projects in a way that many contemporary architects are not thinking about these issues. And I think a very good example of this is the wonderful scheme for Waterloo. Tonight, I think we're all looking forward to Nick really trying to open up some of his interest, the way that he's thinking, the way that he's developing the projects and the possibilities and the roles that might still exist for architects. Would you please join me in welcoming Nick Grimshaw?
Well, thanks very much, Mohsen. I'm sort of brooding on what you said. I suppose that very interestingly, the big difference between things then, when I did my thesis in the 60s, and now, was that there was a hoarding around Covent Garden, around a substantial part of it, 125 acres of it then, and it was all due to be pulled down. So the GLC was doing that. So conservation, you could almost say, has started since that date. In the 30 years I've been in practice, the whole concept of looking after fabric and not tearing things down wholesale perhaps started then, which was quite an interesting thought. And the aim of the thesis was, in fact, that this was wrong to create. It was wrong to create a hole in a city like that, and the whole aim of it was to actually try and stitch the city together with sort of stitching lines to keep it working. And in some ways, that idea has grown and become much more reinforced in current thinking about cities, I think. But I wasn't really intending to start a dialogue with you about my thesis in the 60s. But I do think there are some aspects that I'll be talking about tonight which will tie into that theme, I hope. If we could have the first two slides to kind of get us in the mood. See if I can still read anything. Now I've called this lecture Global Responsibility, which is a very grand title, and what really ought to be called sort of gropings towards global responsibility. But I hope you'll forgive me for possibly the simplicity of some of the concepts here. But I do think that after the Rio conference and now the more recent conference in Kobe, people are thinking about environmental issues on a much more international scale. And I'm very I have always been an optimist, and I want to put a fairly optimistic view tonight that we are entering the third millennium with a much greater degree of global responsibility, certainly than we had when we entered this century. And I think it's interesting to speculate on whether architects can play a role in all this. I just want to divert slightly and talk about one little tiny role I take, I play myself. I won't be looking at that screen anymore, partly because I can't see it, and partly because it's a sort of background. But I do, I can't say I do every day, because my wife's sitting in front of me, but I do try to walk almost every day to work. And one of the significant things about that is that if I did the journey by car, I calculated that I'd need about 300 fully grown trees to counteract the pollution caused. And it gives you just a sort of, it gives me a little bit of sort of self-satisfaction when I'm walking to work that I am saving a bit of pollution. But I think the interesting thing is just how huge that balance is. I mean, that's only something like, I don't know, 2,000 kilometers a year, and yet you need 300 by car, and you need 300 trees to counteract it. And as one of the guys who is running our Eden project in Cornwall said the other day, if the trees and vegetation of the world died, we would all be dead within 2 years. It's quite a sort of somber thought, really, but they are keeping us alive, and it's a very, very significant thing to think about. So if we move on to the next one, please. I'm not going to dwell on the horrors of pollution, I mean, and the desecration and devastation of things around us. One sees so many of these kind of things all the time. I'm going to try and be a little bit more positive next. Rivers are in fact being cleaned up in quite a big way now. There's a terrific amount of consciousness about the filth and pollution that goes into our rivers, and that is starting to happen. And next one. Forests are being suddenly looked at, not as sort of things which ought to be chopped down so you can have fields and put cattle on them and make hamburgers out of the cattle. They're being looked at as areas that should be nurtured, nurtured and can also be cropped and looked after and managed. So managed forestation is a key issue. And we can, for instance, now as architects start to ask the question, if you want to use hardwood, is it coming from a proper source where it's being properly cropped and regrown and so on. Next. These slides going on behind me are just my walk to work, so don't bother about those. The other another issue we've come into in quite a big way recently, having been working in Germany, having a big argument about whether aluminium was or is not a green material. It's a very interesting topic, but the long and short of it is that if you recycle aluminium, you only need about 20% of the energy you use to first smelt it. And there's a very interesting fact that it's been said that in 2020 we may not need to mine aluminium anymore at all, because there'll be enough circulating in the world, so that we have a total recycling system of one of our elements, which is a very interesting thought, really. And at the moment, something like 80% of aluminium is recycled, and very little of raw material is actually added. Next. And similarly, optimistically, car tires are being used for all kinds of things, being used to provide heat, provide road surfaces, and even, as you can see, rather kind of interestingly, to provide shelter on the right. Next. Many metals are being compressed for recycling, and on the right, quite interestingly, you can see nylon clothing being recycled to make tennis balls. Next. Another kind of optimistic issue is the one of using solar cells. And even a company as kind of hard-nosed as Honda, mass-producing cars, are experimenting with solar cells, as the car on the right, which is actually rather elegant and does work. Solar cells in they're not actually solar cell-powered camels, I don't think, but they can play a major role in hot environments, where, for instance, the solar cells can run pumps to work a well without the need for long power lines. Next. Another interesting factor also is that most newsprint now, most paper, is recycled. 80% of the, we discovered when we were doing the Financial Times, 80% of the paper was from recycled sources. And only 20% was actually from pulp, which, again, you could argue that with certain sort of political will and so on, you could cut down you could make all newspapers totally recycled. Next. And, of course, the advent of the compact disc and electronic storage makes a huge impression on the whole idea of paper. That's Bill Gates sitting on a pile of paper with another pile next to him, demonstrating that's the amount of paper you need if it was printed on both sides to get on that compact disc. So there is a certain sort of argument for not typing out everything. And those, I'm not exactly sure how many of those trees floating down the river you need to make the paper, but I suspect quite a large proportion of it. Next. But what's really interesting about this whole issue is the fact that there is a much greater degree of global awareness about it all. this is sort of mapping of deforestation. And I mean, it's horrific, okay, but the interesting thing is that until quite recently, nobody really knew it was going on and what extent it was going, to what extent it was going on. And with this kind of mapping and this way of recording it, you can sort of raise global awareness and raise interest in a topic enormously and start to make governments themselves take notice of the whole thing. Next. Well, we had the first building we did where we applied sort of, if you like, total energy concept to was the RAC building near Bristol. And there we used the BREEAM system. I'm sure everybody knows what it stands for. Something like Building Research Establishment Energy Assessment Method or something like that. Anyway, it's an overall global way of measuring how green your building is. Right from starting with the materials you use, how you do the excavation, right through to how much energy you actually use in running the building. We did this, the RAC being almost one of the most conservative bodies you might imagine, the Royal Automobile Club, was surprisingly sort of proactive in this area, and they had a green advisor who worked quite closely with us on the building. We ended up getting a rating of 8 out of 10, which we thought wasn't bad for a sort of a first go, and we learnt a great deal in the process. It's actually a concrete floor, it's a concrete structure, and we use the slabs very much to retain the coolth or the heat of the building, which you don't achieve if you use suspended floors and suspended ceilings. And the general energy consumption was extremely low. We also used totally fresh air, bringing in air from the outside, which, as you all know, for about at least 6 months of the year is probably the temperature you want it at inside anyway, if you can get enough of it in the building. And we added minimum amounts of heat and coolth, which we then extracted from the fresh air before we threw it away. So there's nothing recycled in terms of the air. And that's one of the biggest complaints everybody has about the office buildings is the idea of breathing the same air circulated round and round. So we avoided that issue. And if we move on to the next one, just plan and section, we went for pretty nearly the most efficient plan we could get. So short of being circular, it's actually cam-shaped. The outside is open plan, flexible space. The inside is meeting rooms, thus reversing the normal pattern for an office where the bosses have offices on the corners of the building and the workforce are all in interior spaces. We turned it round and we had the offices and meeting rooms round this atrium, entered with 3-floor building entered in the middle, as you can see here. And everybody uses the staircase. The 500 or 600 people in the building don't use the lift. The lift's really for disabled and goods moving, thus causing people to keep fit and causing the interaction which they felt they were missing in the 7 different buildings they were in before. And it works very well as a community. Next. And the working conditions, as you can see, we've got uplighting to concrete coffers, very nice, gentle lighting effect. And the big thing was they're all working on computers, but they did want to see out of the building. And as many of you will know, there's a complete sort of, don't know what the word is, conflict between trying to see out of a building and computer screens. And we shaded the building very heavily from light falling from above. We have, in fact, in this case, a tinted glass, and we also have blinds which they can pull down in extremis, but they don't actually need to. But they do need a rest place for their eyes to look out over the countryside. And a hell of a lot of work went into trying to make that system work. And on the right, you can see the staircase in the middle of the atrium, which everyone uses. Next. Now, one of the topics I want to talk about particularly tonight is this issue of flexibility and what how this can help with making architecture kind of more long-lasting and more usable. I think if you set about doing the bones of a building well, then a building will last very much longer. The bones are the core of a building, and it can be then recycled and reclad, and a lot of things can be done to it. If the bones are not well thought out and usable, then the building won't last. This is the stock exchange in Berlin. Next. And I was talking about this to Mosen earlier, that this is, we're talking about how people get going in offices. This model on the left was done by a student who was just doing a few weeks in the office. Moved us on quite a bit, actually, on the project. We occupy, the key to, it was an international competition which was held in about 91, which we won, and I think one of the reasons was that we kept the whole building low. It's 25,000 square meters, or 250,000 square feet, and it's a low building. And the way we did it was to occupy the whole of the site. We sort of pushed our way back, made a very deep building, and sort of squashed it down like a sort of low hill. There's a lot of resistance against tower blocks in Berlin, and we think that was one of the reasons why we won it. And the other one was the idea of being able to have a street frontage where people could flow along, sort of concourse behind, and you can see everything that's going on in the building, which is also a fairly rare thing in Berlin. The reason I'm mentioning it now is that we had on the ground floor a conference centre and a stock exchange, both of which indeterminate size, needing a lot of space. And we decided to use this arch form and hang the floors so that the ground floor could remain free. And I think that's something which probably could, a huge number of city buildings could benefit from, in the sense that you can then replan and redo the ground floors of them ad infinitum. I'll come back to that in a minute. I want to talk about this idea of re-skinning and recladding. Can we have the next one? These are the bones going up, steel arches, with all from which the floors are hung. Next one. Lobsters, which shed their skin, called a carapace. Next. And there you see part of the skin just shed from a lobster, and that's the skin of the Ludwig Erhard house, because one of the great benefits of the computer age is that you can do buildings with two-dimensional curves, three-dimensional curves very easily. And this was just showing reading the shape of the outside of it. Next. Oh, I've forgotten about these. These are two new slides. Quite relatively recently, showing the skin going on. And you can see, if you look at the sort of relative width of some of these sort of buildings, here it's a typical office building, compare with this building, it's very, very big. We penetrate in with these atriums, these glazed atriums coming in. But basically, we kept it very low and occupied the entire site. Next. You'll find various little diversions going as we go through. But I very much like this idea of recycling and redoing things. Just like this weaver bird rebuilds its nest every year to a very nice pattern. Next one. And I couldn't resist comparing it to the insides of the linear accelerator on the outside. There's some nice sort of connection between something entirely natural and something entirely technological, but both really being the same thing. Next. In going back to a very early building of ours, which was a very simple panel building done for Herman Miller. It's now 20 years old, and that was designed so that these panels and glazed panels and even the courtyards where those two umbrellas are could all be changed and moved around the outside of the building. It's changed a great deal over the years. Of course, the planners quite a bit of a problem because they don't know quite what they approved, what they gave planning permission for. But nobody's objected, and it has served a great deal of need for the people inside, in that they could put more glass where they needed it, and when they changed the operations inside, and they could put more solid where they needed it in terms of when they had a lot of warehousing. So it's proved itself over a period of 20 years. Next one. And then we went on to do another one for them where we used aluminium panels, which again are all interchangeable with the glazed panels. And it's quite interesting. This was mainly warehousing originally. It's now half manufacturing, and put a lot more glazed parts in it. That's using aluminium panels, which of course are completely recyclable. Next. Easy to make on a brake press. They hold the tool themselves. They want more panels, they just stamp out a few more on a very simple frame. Next one. And we've done a similar job in Germany, in Cologne. There's the happy client with his happy architect. And it's one of those jobs which is very nice to have got. The chap actually walked in the front door and said, I want you to do a factory for me. And I said, well, you know, we're terribly busy at the moment. We were doing Waterloo. And he said, no, but look, seriously, I want you to do me a factory. And I said, well, you better come in. And and I said, well, you know, what? He said, I want a flexible factory. And I said, well, do you know what the kind of things we've done? He said, yes, I've visited all your buildings, he said. And I said, what, do you mean all of them? He said, yes, all of them, and you're the architect I want. So it doesn't happen to you very often, I can tell you, so don't get too excited. But, and it's been that sort of relationship with him ever since then. It's been absolutely, when you get a client like that, you practically will lay your life down for them. And most people don't realize that. He's probably got, you know, he's probably had 3 times the number of hours and attention than anyone else would have got, just simply because he sort of believes in what you're doing. Next one. And you can see there, that's the sort of first phase of it. This is the phases of development of that building. It started off just like that, and we've now just got to here. And that last square is going to go in one hit in September. And it's a very, very big manufacturing space, but you can see the idea of having a flexible and expandable building which can be used for many, many different purposes. Next one. And I like the idea of buildings being able to change their skins and offer different degrees of reflection and colour and density in their skins. and they don't have to be there permanently. Next one. You see it happening in nature. I think we should see it happening on our buildings. Next one. We know chameleons, but we don't necessarily know, things like the chevron butterfly fish, which changes in colour between day and night. I think these are going to be some of the things that our glazing systems can do as they start to develop in the 21st century. There are a lot of things glass can do which is only just being explored now. And if I was in your shoes as students, I'd certainly be looking at some of the possibilities of things that glass can do. I mean, already you can make glass be act as solar absorbers. You can make it go completely opaque, either clear or completely opaque. You can already for years you've been able to make it dim down with the sun, but it's very expensive. There are now all kinds of you can introduce heating into glass very easily. You can actually use flat screen technology and have images on the glass. I mean, just a few little kind of ideas to leave you with. Next one. But we tried this with our entry for the V&A, which Daniel Libeskind won with a very well-known building you'll all know. And we were the runner-up, I'm reliably told. But the idea was that it was a completely different concept. I mean, the idea of the building was that you there are 7 miles of corridor in the V&A, 7 miles of things to see. And the idea was this was an orientation building. And we wanted to use this cube, which could, at different times of the day, show all kinds of different things. We were going to use this kind of glass which could go opaque and act as a screen, or it could go clear and show perhaps a beautiful object, like a Chinese vase behind it, floodlit at night. So the idea was the whole cube was an information cube, but it was also filled with objects. So it was real objects from within the museum, which could be changed, at a very regular basis. So it not only was a kind of electronic tool and an orientational thing, but also you had real objects, really beautiful objects to look at when the museum was closed. And on top of that, the building was flexible in the sense that it could be altered around on a systematic way for exhibitions. Next. And this was the kind of thing you could do with the same 2 objects. This is a model we took into them to show how you could do different effects with the same objects at night, and lighting it up in one way on the right and backlighting it with a just an opaque screen in front. Next. Well, just the idea of a building shedding its skin is rather appealing to me. And animals do it, I don't see why we shouldn't do it. Now, another aspect of this whole idea of flexibility, next, is what you can do with existing buildings. This was a printing works turned into block of flats. And next, this rather amazingly for those of us who were around in the 60s or 70s, was quite a well-known office building. One of the first sort of SOM type, Seagram type buildings in London, Kestrel House, as it was called then. It's now being turned into flats, which is a very, very interesting piece of recycling. Maybe many people never thought that office buildings would start to be turned into flats. And it's actually rather encouraging kind of sign, I think. And it may be in the end that they'll all be flats and people will be working from home from their computers. That's another issue. Next. But going back to this idea of urban flexibility, this was an early sketch sort of showing this idea of having everything hanging from the arch. It does have this effect of being able to give you complete freedom at ground level. Next one. And the building's now nearing completion. No one's seen it. These are the first time anyone's seen these pictures, but this is the end elevation showing the hangars coming down with kind of prongs sticking out. This is obviously it's the last bay, so you have to do something with the hangars. But as that reaches the ground, it leaves a huge span empty for doing anything you like. Next. And just for a bit of fun, I showed that's the plan as it is with the stock exchange, which has got smaller and smaller over the years. We've got restaurants and things here, the conference centre. I put Oxford Ice Rink into it, which was a building we did some years ago. Fits quite neatly in there. And of course, would work. There's no columns in the way. You can't have columns in an ice rink. And so in an urban situation, you could start to introduce things like that. If the stock exchange goes electronic, as it may well do, and moves out, you could put the ice rink in instead. Or you could put a film theatre in for the Berlin Film Festival, which is next door, and needs more space. So it's an idea for urban, to think about in terms of urban spaces and how they can change in activity and texture over a period of time. Next. So moving on to this whole issue of communications, it's very interesting that we read such a lot about people working from home, and yet when I set out in a systematic way to try and find good pictures of people working from home, it was almost impossible. Obviously, most people work in a complete tip of some sort, or let it sort of grow in a completely unorganized way. There's very, very little real sort of help in people organizing themselves to work at home, it perhaps would seem. But this is the best I could do, which doesn't show much. But the whole idea of working from home and working from where you live is fascinating. Next. And I've read that some countries are seriously considering switching straight to mobile phone systems without putting the wires in at all, which is a fascinating concept. No poles down the roads, no wires anywhere. And if you combine that with solar collection for electricity, and on a village by village or town by town basis, you don't need any wires between anything. And apart from saving an awful lot of copper mining, it's a very, very interesting concept, I think. So if you then sort of speculate on that, what do you come to cities for? Next one. They become sort of cultural exchanges. This was when they wrapped the Reichstag in Berlin, Christo's famous wrapping, which turned into the most amazing sort of cultural event throughout the city. People came from miles around, and actually, according to guys and girls working in my office, I think most of whom took the day off, it was an enormously sort of bonding experience. And I find that sort of thing very interesting in terms of starting to think what cities are actually for. I don't really think they're for they're necessary for having thousands of office blocks standing side by side with people sweating it out in air-conditioned environments. Next. And, you know, you might say that in Siena, the Palio is something which also is a great city event, or in Japan, the festival on the right. People do have a pretty strong concept of what a city can do for themselves, do for them culturally. Next. So how do we, is there some way you can convey the idea that urbanization can be pretty catastrophic and persuade people to stay decentralized? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's worth thinking about. Next. And the idea of kind of, even in remote situations, being able to communicate may help the idea that perhaps you don't have to all pile in to a heap in a city. If personally, I don't think people will turn their backs on cities, but I think they will start to want to improve them pretty fast. Next. Greenery or greening in cities is going to become a big issue, I think. And it isn't the fact that because it's not there you can't have it. It can be introduced. And I think this is one of the big factors that might start to come into play in the next few years, hopefully in urban environments. Next. And it can be done on a big scale or even on a small scale, but it all helps. Next one. And much better public transport. I think the key thing about public transport is that people aren't going to use it unless it's of a very, very high standard. And effectively, I think we have to face up to the fact that it's got to be as a higher standard as their car. And that means quite a difference in change and culture in terms of investment and in terms of the whole running and organisation of the thing. We were recently involved in a competition for San Francisco Bay Bridge and the Trans-Bay Terminal. And one of the big issues there was to pick up people in the suburbs in air-conditioned, really, really well-organised buses where they could actually work and had plugs for their computers and so on, bring them over the bridge on a special lane and into a special terminal next to downtown. And for every bus would wipe out 40 cars. And I mean, it's a very interesting concept, which has absolutely zero political support, apparently. Next one. So it's frozen for the moment. But the idea of introducing trams in city streets amongst people, I think, is an interesting one. Or also, you know, the maglev idea where the transport just weaves its way around a city, but always of a very high standard. Either way, next one, we're somehow we're going to start, I hope, to react against this kind of thing, not just for very personal reasons that we don't like breathing the fumes, but because the harm it does the globe as a whole. And I see some big issues for architects coming up here. And at the same time as all this urban thinking is going on, I think people are thinking much more about their natural environment. Next one. This happens to be near where we have a building in Spain, in La Coruña, and it was just about like that last time I was there. the 100-kilometre-an-hour wind. But the impact of nature on man, I think, is lost when you're anchored in cities all the time. And I think people, when they do get out, suddenly are wiped out by the impact of it. And I think that's going to, that is going to have, people are going to feel that need more and more as the ability to travel happens. People need another dimension in their lives. Next. And, you know, doing this sort of thing, if you can see that fellow, you know, can make quite an impact on your life, or walking along a ledge like that. As time goes by, I think more and more people realize what impact that kind of relationship with nature can give you. Next one. And it doesn't matter what the dimension is. It can be mountains, it can be the sea, it can be the jungle. Next. Or you can just hang over a cliff on the Pacific coast. These was part of a series of photographs taken by Anselm Adams hanging over the cliff, just taking waves sequentially as they came in. Next. And under the sea as well, which from myself, I've only just discovered that. I was absolutely, totally wiped out. Not being a good swimmer or anything like that, but just my wife bought me a pair of goggles with lenses in them, and I could suddenly see underwater and see this kind of thing. And you can see in a good clear sea, you can see, you know, hundreds of feet, and it does make an impact. Next one. And similarly, people can experience jungles and forests and everything in reach of their urban environment because of the ability to travel. Next. But one of the absolutely key issues is how can we enjoy all these natural wonders of the world without destroying it? And it's a critical issue which is coming up, and again something which I think where architecture can play a big role. Next one. One way you can do it, which is quite interesting, is on the right, which is an artificial beach in Japan, totally internal. Some of you might know it. You know, to those of us who grew up sort of going natural seaside, it's a kind of rather horrific concept. But equally, not everyone can go to beautiful beaches all the time. And this idea of simulation is something which is going to make quite a big impact over coming years, I suspect. Which leads me on to saying a few words about our Eden project. Next. Which is a huge disused quarry, China clay mine in Cornwall, where our clients have this mad idea of creating the biggest greenhouse in the world to study plant species as populations of plants, particularly food plants, how they interact, how they grow, and how they can benefit man with different climates inside each of the biomes, as they're called. And it was this rather visionary fellow who made the point when he was doing a press launch recently that if the plants in the world go, there's none of us in 2 years' time. So this is one way, if we could have the next one, of trying to simulate an environment, trying to show, I mean, because apart from the serious scientific base behind this project, people will be able to walk through it. They will genuinely be able to experience what, say, a rainforest is like, but also see the value of it and see that perhaps it's not necessarily totally wise to chop them all down. They will have very good teaching and general audio-visual background to the whole thing to explain what's happening to the globe and how fast it's being destroyed, and how forests and everything can be nurtured. Next. We've had a lot of fun with the geometry of this. If you can see that red line following around there, that's the cut-off line from this spherical geometry. That's where the ground hits it. So that part goes, and that bit's the bit that's above ground. Next. And then you start to develop this. We've been using the hexagonal geometry. Next. These segments are 9 meters across, and it's a ETFE material, very, very light, just strong enough, but it's still strong enough to walk across, self-cleaning and obviously replaceable, with they're sort of pillows which are kept inflated with dry air, and the inflation top-up is done by pumps work from solar cells. Next. Just thought I'd find a little example in nature. Exactly the same structure of the eye of that beetle. Next one. And that's the site plan. You can see the huge greenhouse running around here. The lake in the middle. Visitor centre just here. Next. And we've been having a lot of fun with the visitor centre, which in a sense we're trying to use a fairly green approach on that, using timber construction, grass roofs and so on. Next. And these are laminated timber beams inside that shell, and working on foot details. These are all done by a student who dropped by for 5 weeks recently. These models, and they're the feet of the shell for that visitor centre. Next. And there are other ways of visiting natural events without being too invasive. On the left there's this rather lovely sort of walkway system through an actual forest, but it stops you sort of taking it apart. And here is a huge inflated sort of geometric structure which is let down by helicopter onto the forest canopy, and then the scientists can go out and collect flora and fauna from the canopy of the forest, and then at the end of the day the helicopter just comes and winches it away again. So they've made no permanent impact on the forest. Next. It must be near the end because I'm getting into Fitzroy Square. But the key issue really is how do we learn to not destroy the landscape we've come to love. And I'm just going to leave you with that thought, but and I'm sure simulation isn't the only answer to it. Next. It's a time also for thinking about the impact of manufacturing. We now can produce complete cars with electronically controlled machines. It won't be long before we can produce them in complete darkness, underground, without the intervention of man. And therefore, we've got an interesting aspect coming forward as to, whereas quite a large part of the population used to work in manufacturing industries, what are they going to do? And that might have some impact on the countryside as well. Next. But they are still going to leisure, and this sort of whole idea of broadening the dimensions of people's lives, I think, is going to be one aspect of it. This is a procession in Japan. That's Siena again. Next. And people start taking much more interest in things like sculpture. This is Rachel Whitread's casting of the interior of a house in the East End. You've probably seen a lot about it in the papers. People are getting much more interested in the arts, partly perhaps because they have a little more leisure. We spent a lot of time going interviewing artists for this sculpture in Waterloo, this sculpture called Channel Fish by Jean-Luc Villemout. And that's caused a lot of interest too. So art is coming into play and making a big interaction in people's lives. Next. And of course you come to the city for major events like the opera and processions. Next. And for having a lot of fun, which we'll all be doing in our lovely dome. So just finally a few closing thoughts. Next. What do we like to sort of look at rural idyls and say, isn't this marvelous? Why can't everyone carry on doing that? And of course they can't, and they don't want to. Next. They'd rather have an outboard than a paddle. And although we may think this is fantastic ethnic construction and write books about it, are we sure the people living there would not rather be in a mobile home? It's very difficult kind of dialogue to have this. Next. Can we even counsel people not to cut down all their forests when we in this country, which is largely forested itself, have done it ourselves? We may have done it a few hundred years ago, but we did it. We chopped all our trees down and turned them into fields and put cows on them. Well, someone in Brazil cutting down the rainforest can perfectly well say, well, why can't we do the same thing? All we're doing is chopping down the trees, planting grass and putting cows on them. So it's not a very simple dialogue, this, at all, I don't think, to take on board. Next. What we can do, and what we sort of professionals perhaps, or what you potentially as architects can do, is to offer layers of expertise. Here, greening the desert, or building a rather beautiful suspension bridge. Next. Or helping to build a solar installation which can supply electricity for a large number of people, or helping with building dams, which can be done in a horrible and hideous way or in a beautiful way. So there are things we can do and things which we can offer without to improve people's lives without necessarily becoming too holy about it. Next. Oh, and I've just remembered that our Seville Pavilion, which was designed to be taken into pieces at the end of the Expo 92, which as an alternative, Mrs. Thatcher flogged to the lowest bidder. The highest bidder, was meant to be dismantled And the solar cells were meant to be used to work pumps, which were also used working as water wall, and the water tanks, which formed the whole of the west wall. So we were planning to make them supply 30 little installations like this for villages. But there was a little bit of hopeful thinking there in the middle of a raging capitalist regime, which didn't quite come off. And finally, next one, my last two slides, which you may find quite difficult to tie together. But they're both hopeful in a way. On the right, you've got a building which has obviously been there for an enormous length of time, being resurfaced or reclad, if you like, in a very simple way. Pot of clay being thrown up to the chap up the ladder, who plants it on the wall, and you can even see the imprint of his fingers. That's one way of leaving your mark on a building, I suppose. And but it's kind of encouraging. There's a kind of everlasting process going on there. And in the other, on the other hand, here you've got these planes parked in the desert being broken up and the aluminium being recycled, which is something I mentioned very early on. So I want to leave to close down on a sort of note of hope that if people's consciousness is widened, and if they think about these issues of looking after our globe, then there's actually an awful lot we can do. And from looking from your student point of view, as you are now, I think there's some absolutely fascinating topics and subjects you can address on this sort of front. And in many ways, I'm quite envious. Thank you very much. All right.
So I'm sure Nick will take some questions. Can you take the microphone, Roland?
The slide you showed from the Expo Pavilion made me curious to ask, what did actually happen with the pavilion?
Well, it's in 92 containers on the North Circular Road. It was sold to an entrepreneur who wanted to use it for an Asian wedding centre, and he's been trying ever since to get urban grants and so on. It's actually quite a nice scheme, but so far it's not come off.
Thanks.
You've looked into ways of reusing materials and stuff like that. What about the reuse? Speaking to us.
But they can't hear you in the back.
Oh, okay, sorry. And what about the reuse of space itself? Imposing several programs over the space, not just of the lifetime of a building, but over the day, from day till night, reusing that space. Have you ever considered that in your projects?
Well, I think that does take place quite a lot. I mean, well, certainly when I started off in life, I slept and worked in the same room all day. I mean, my office was where I worked, where I slept. And I think that happens quite a bit. Whether we're going to come to a time where you get office buildings in the city where the guys can sleep, on one side of the building and work on the other, I don't know. But I think a greater mix of activity is something, if that's what you mean, I think is a great, would be a great boon.
The sort of
in
physical ability or attributes of a room to be able to accommodate several different types of program, but that sort of generated intelligently instead of just us slumming,
Yes. Well, I mean,
For example, you know, the sort of issue of ownership of an office. If you were to remove the kind of, if every office was to be identical, for example, in an office building, you could have an office building that filled up without people having their individual spaces or groups of spaces, where all the information and facilities were downloaded or something to the work table, the work surface.
sounds like you're working towards quite an interesting project.
I wrote about your station terminal at Waterloo, and when I went to visit it, and I was shown around by one of your assistants, I was really struck by how much of it is actually under the ground in the existing base work of the old Waterloo station. And in this respect, it reminded me, oddly enough, of the Sainsbury Centre that Norman Foster did at East Anglia. And I then began to think about the relation between what Kenneth Frampton's called the earthworks, the sort of groundworks of buildings, and canopies, in relation to Buckminster Fuller's obsessions with the weights of buildings. And you mentioned very briefly with that photograph of the motorcar factory about the idea of certain things being underground. Now, in relation to ecology, there are some considerations about, as it were, the tectonics of lightweight things and the tectonics of heavyweight things that might be in the ground or under the ground. And I wondered if you've developed a sort of comprehensive position on that.
Well, it is a very interesting topic, and it's actually very surprising how unsuccessful most attempts at using the underground have been. I think, again, probably modern technology can help a lot there. You know, they've usually broken down on systems, on things like dampness and lack of insulation and water pressure and all kinds of things like that. But nowadays, the sort of technology we've got will allow you to do it a hell of a sight more effectively, I suspect. And in a way, also, not going underground, but banking up ground round buildings is also extremely effective. So I'm with you all the way.
But I was just wondering if you, I mean, the sheds and the superstructures that you've made, you've created a very vivid degree of, as it were, figuration or metaphor. And I wondered if, in a sense, you have an attitude to concrete mass, as it were, that is as vivid as what you've been doing with superstructures.
Probably not. But there's a lot of it's quite a wide topic. I mean, there's a lot of prejudice against. I mean, if you build, for instance, we're doing the National Space Science Centre in Leicester, which is in an huge underground water tank at the moment, and I think it's a marvellous reuse of a building, but I think it's only possible as a sort of millennium project because it's something that it rather captures people's imagination. I think if you tried to get a sort of developer to use a huge underground water tank, or somebody to actually invest money in it, you would find it very, very difficult. It's also difficult in economic terms that to build, for instance, a 6 meter underground tank and put a roof on it is a lot more expensive than to build a 6 meter high building and put a roof on that. So there's an economic issue, and until you can get people to take really seriously the energy savings over a long period of time and so on and so forth, you'll find it very, very difficult to convince anyone.
On this question of urban dispersion that you were talking about, the fact that certain aspects of technology maybe will also allow a different kind of attitude towards cities, and somehow with a lot of slides then there was the focus on the symbolic dimension of the city. Don't you think that there's a kind of contradiction there, where somehow the very aspect of that symbolic dimension relies on certain notions of congestion, of actual urban intensity, and somehow if you do end up with a great deal of dispersion, it makes it harder for the kind of interaction and vitality that seems to be also an important part of contemporary urbanism in many of the kind of interesting cities. Somehow I'm not quite sure how dispersion comes to produce symbolic urbanism.
Well, I think the very interesting thing about we were talking a lot about it in the 60s, and in fact when I left the AA, I went to do whatever it was called, fellowship or something at MIT, and the subject was the implication on urban conurbations of vertical takeoff transportation. And I didn't get very far because I got a job and came home. But the interesting thing was there's a lot of talk about it then in the late 60s about what, because of potential ability to use vertical transportation and all the technology that was available then, which is just the same as it is now, except in a more primitive form, that people would disperse from cities, which had some, then and now some pretty hellish aspects to them. But it simply hasn't happened. And I suspect it hasn't happened because people like what happens in cities, or a lot of what happens in cities. And basically, I think sort of energy is probably better directed towards trying to make them better places than going on about the idea that everybody should disperse and not live in them. But it's just interesting that as more and more technology becomes available and it becomes easier and easier, is there going to be a point? I mean, there are plenty of farms in Cornwall which are computer centres, etc., and it is happening in a quiet way. But it's very interesting to see how far any of that really will go, and how far people are going to hold on to the cities and enrich them, I think.
One more? Just if you could be quick.
Within the context of the office, do sort of these technological ideas infiltrate your meetings with, the way when you meet you'll decide on certain ideas whether to accept or, cull others to make way for these ideas? I'm talking about that. I'm talking about sort of that you were talking a lot about skins and intelligent use of skins in building, intelligent skin structures. Who is the person, or how do those kind of ideas infiltrate into your office, for example? And is it something that you're conscious of, or that's something that just drips in, or you think it could be a way that the architectural profession matures to perhaps have somebody who constantly does that?
Nearly enough philosophizing in our office, I suspect, either on technological base or on any other base. I mean, everyone's got their head down, working away really hard. But we're starting to turn it round, and we've now built ourselves a much nicer meeting space. It works really well, and we're inviting people in to talk to us, which is helping to cross borders and so on. And we also have quite a lot more of people presenting their own project to the others, which didn't used to happen nearly enough. So that stimulates discussion. But you're right. There are people, even in a small setup like ours, there are people talking animatedly to each other about a particular way of doing cladding, where there's people somewhere else not even thinking about it. And but it's quite difficult to keep all that going.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for coming.